The challenge for people who are new to this is understanding when it's important. When do you need to flip that switch? And after a full day's work, it's very difficult to do.
You know what I find most difficult is when I'm at the end of my day and I'm a bit exhausted
Yeah.
mentally because I work sitting down. I'm never exhausted physically, but I am exhausted mentally sometimes, feeling like my brain was squeezed for all the juice. And then I've got two kids, and all the havoc that comes with that, and you have to take them somewhere and go somewhere, and you've got these errands to run. And so at some point, it's like my willpower for empathy uh disappears. It's like it's done. My empathy battery is depleted. And so what I find myself is I become a bit more mean, a bit more reactive, right? I'm not as tactical is I guess the word that the Black Swan group would use. I'm not as tactical about my communication, and these are the moments when I most regret it. Like, I wish I had a way to be tactical about my empathy all the time.
It's hard, man. It's hard. And it's hard because you're a human being. And so you sit down and do your work most of the day, but you're talking all of the time. And that depletes a lot of energy. The idea here is not to think about tactical empathy or empathetic listening as a 24-hour a day, 7-day a week endeavor, because it's impossible. Because to your point, when you are listening at the deepest level, you are expending much more energy than if you were listening at an intermittent level, where you're listening to me intermittently, where you're listening to me just long enough to get the general idea of what I'm saying, and then you start focusing on your own internal monologue. That's easy to do. Empathetic listening for motivation, listening for the person's perspective, their worldview, and how they fit in it. It's a heavy lift, man. And so the challenge for people who are new to this is understanding when it's important. When do you need to flip that switch? And after a full day's work, it's very difficult to do. And so one of the things that you can try is, you've heard of the technique of labeling from the Black Swan group. Well, you can actually self-label before you engage your kids, before you engage your spouse in the evening. In self-labeling, identifying that you're moody, identifying for yourself that you're tired, actually saying those words in your mind: I'm tired right now, I'm moody right now. And that will dissipate the negative emotions and dynamics that are bouncing around in your amygdala, because that's what's fired up at that point. When you start to get moody and you start to become short with those who are closest to you, it's because you've given everything to everybody else, and now they're asking for attention and time, and your amygdala is fired up because of that. And when your amygdala is fired up, what's supposed to be going on in the prefrontal cortex does not occur. And so to help mitigate that amygdala flare up, just self-label, and that will put you back on the right track to looking for the motivation behind the statement or the behavior that you're dealing with your loved ones at the end of the day.
Yeah, that's a great point. Self-labeling is I'd say is an advanced way to use this technique. I don't use it as much in myself. I should be, and I will be. The two people I use labeling on the most, I think, at this point in my life, are my kids, where they'll start talking about something, and I'll try to either figure out how they feel and try to feed it back to them, or ask the last word or three words. Right, my daughter will be telling me about this thing that happened, and I would be asking the question back. She's like, yeah, and then she keeps talking and talking and talking. So I find labeling most useful as a parent, because what I think happens is it helps my kids identify how they feel,
Yes.
and as a result they come down faster.
And more importantly, you're lending them an ear, and you're showing interest. And we are, as human beings, I don't care if they're children or they're 90 years old, as human beings, we all have this almost unquenchable thirst to have somebody else understand what our perspective is. And when you start to use those skills, for example, with your kids, you're changing chemicals in their brain in the moment. And that's why they get excited about it. That's why they feel good about it. They don't know that it's occurring, but as soon as you mirror the last 1 to 3 words that your daughter said, her face lights up, and she, boom, she gives you more information. Why? Because you've made her feel good in the moment. And all of us have that. All of us have that drive. And to your earlier point, when we were talking about um, how communication skills should be taught at a younger age, and it would help us to avoid all of this conflict, truer words could never have been spoken. This is why we are in the mess that we're in globally, is because we just don't appreciate the power of communication, positively and negatively. Um, and as soon as the sooner that we would just sit down and have a dialogue with someone that we disagree with, the better off we all would be. Because even the people that we disagree with want to be understood, want to be heard. And these skills are born out of the world of hostage negotiation. And I can tell you right now, every person that I dealt with on the other end of that phone who was a hostage taker or who was threatening to commit suicide, we started off at opposite ends of the continuum. We started off as, for lack of a better term, adversarial. And yet, and still, in the US, our success rate at influencing surrender is close to 94%. And it's not because we're smart, it's because we have a keen appreciation of the human nature response, which dictates negative emotions and negative dynamics, drive decision making, and drive behavior. Full stop.
Yo, it's Igor. I want you to have my Amazon best-selling book for free for taking the time to listen to my podcast and to watch my YouTube videos. Now, I'm not only going to give you this book for free, but I'm going to throw in about $3.2 thousand in free bonuses. Now, if you want to get this book, please click the link in the description, or you can also go to igorsbook.com. And now, back to the podcast. It's really interesting that you mentioned that because, as I mentioned, I grew up in Ukraine, and you talk about communication. So in Ukraine, even police officers, they don't really act like you describe. There's no such thing as communication. In Ukraine or Russia or Eastern Europe, police officers will hit you first before they'll talk to you, and any interrogation would result in you having broken bones. And it's not going to be a communication. There's not going to be good cop, bad cop. There's not going to be any sort of advanced psychology happening there. You know, right now, for example, the conflict between Ukraine and Russia, or parts of Ukraine and Russia, because it's a lot more complicated than just generalized Ukraine. You know, I can completely understand that, because having grown up there, it was never about communication. In fact, people who spoke or who tried to resolve conflict with words would usually be considered annoying and got hit in the face much faster than if they were to show strength by being violent, because then the other violent party would think twice before starting a fight with them, right?
Mhm.
So in other words, it was frowned upon to be a geek, if you will, because you would get punched all the time, every day, absolutely everywhere. And so I was growing up, I was never big, I was never fast. I mean, I'm a Jewish kid growing up in Ukraine, so I was smart, but I was never physically gifted. And so, even though my only advantage would have been my my language skills, I still couldn't use them, because the moment you start talking, the other guy gets annoyed and he just starts swinging, and that gets transferred into the adult communication as well, where almost any conflict is usually resolved in a fight.
So the response to you wanting to engage in dialogue becomes violence. you will hear me talk. You probably have heard me talk ad nauseum about staying curious in the conversation. Now, physical violence is it's really hard to stay curious, but when we step back and look at it as a non-participant or a non-combatant, you got to ask yourself the question: where is that coming from? Does it line up logically that I want to talk to this person and their first inclination when I start talking is annoyance and then striking me? That doesn't make a lot of sense. And so when one's behavior does not line up with the realities of the environment, it's always coming from an emotional place. And so this person who is lashing out and striking a person who wants to engage them in dialogue is being emotional. They will not characterize it as that. They would characterize it as I don't need to waste time. I need to get stuff done, and boom. And this is the way that I've gotten information or cooperation in the past. So this is what I'm going to do going forward. And so curiosity is what's missing in most of our conversations because we're so focused on where we want to end up. We're so focused on what our agenda is, what our goal and objective is, and we're married to the point where we're not listening to the other side because in most cases they are talking about something that's diametrically opposed to what I'm talking about or what I need or what I want. And so um, but back to your point, as far as cultures are concerned, um, I hear I hear statements like yours often, and it's usually born out of the fact that we've got nobody that's willing to take the first step and to try. It's not by accident that hostage negotiators all over the globe are trained in the same skill set. So, hostage negotiators in Tokyo, in Melbourne, in Mumbai, in Tel Aviv, in Frankfurt, London, Johannesburg, the US, North America, South America, they're all trained in the same skill set. Doesn't matter what you look like, it doesn't matter where you come from because it's not based on any of that. It's based on the human nature response. And once you get your head around this idea that negative emotions and negative dynamics drive decision making and drive behavior, your communication, your ability to influence is increased. You are at a distinct advantage over those you're engaging with because they now become predictable.
Right. No, you're absolutely right. The way I remember Ukraine back when I was growing up, I remember not even being able to communicate with my parents either. Like the moment I would try to get, it was basically labeled as getting smart with the parents because you're just supposed to listen and shut up. It would result in the exact same thing. You would get smacked or something. But you're right. If I had the tools,
Yeah.
if I was a 7-year old and I could label, and I remember one time I actually did that accidentally. My mom caught me smoking, but she didn't catch me with a cigarette. She just saw that I had like a hole in my clothes, like from a cigarette.
Yeah.
And I started trying to lie my way out of it, and she wouldn't buy it. And then I started, kind of weeping, and she's like, "What's the matter? Why are you crying?" And I was like, "Because you don't believe me. You don't believe me." And I said it a couple of times, like, no matter what I say, you don't believe me. And you know what happened? I got off the hook. So I don't know why. I'm pretty sure she didn't believe me still, but I wasn't punished that day. She just told me, "Okay, go, just go." It seems like stating the obvious maybe injected some dopamine or whatever into the brain chemistry, whatever. And she calmed down, and she's like, "Okay, well, whatever," and off you go.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, at the age of, I don't, you said you were 7 at the time?
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah. So at the age of 7, you had this internal drive to state the obvious. Obviously, you were motivated to save your own skin, so that
yes,
probably improved your performance quite a bit. But to your point, we are constantly, and I've never really thought about it before today, we are constantly pointing out the obvious with our counterparts. That's what most of the Black Swan skills are all about, is uncovering and highlighting the obvious, and being fearless about it. When you know that you're going to go into your boss's office to basically demand a pay increase, the obvious from their perspective is they're going to think that this is a bad time to have this discussion. They're going to think that you're being greedy. They're going to think that your work effort doesn't line up with your requested increase. They're going to think that this is just another problem on a long list of problems that they have to deal with. Now they have to deal with you. I know those four things automatically are going to be in my boss's head when I go into the room to ask him for a pay increase. So the first thing I'm going to do is throw those out in front of the conversation. Before I even get to my ask, I'm going to say those things. And immediately I take permission and authority away from them for using those against me when I ultimately ask them for my pay increase. Immediately, I have articulated negative emotions and dynamics that they have not articulated yet. So I'm saying something that they're thinking, and I look like a mind reader. And again, it starts to change the chemicals in the brain, putting them in a more positive state. The more of the negatives that you can mitigate with this preemptive label or this accusations audit, the more you put them in a positive state. And there's research out there that says that the brain works up to 31% better when it's in a positive state. So every time that I sit down with a counterpart, that's one of my first goals, is to try to put them in an as positive state as possible, because I want them to be clear of mind when I ultimately make my ask. And failure to point out the obvious, as you described, it puts you at a distinct disadvantage. You do that at your own peril, and it's not easy. It's not easy. It's probably one of the most counterintuitive aspects of the Black Swan method, when you start to articulate things that haven't been spoken yet.